I'm Garry Isaacs with MyIntegrityPath.com. Today it's time to take a break. It's Saturday, so let's take a vacation from dealing with serious personal affairs and make a scenic trip. We'll be visiting some of the best scenery west of the Tetons. Grab your snacks and enjoy the ride. We'll be traveling eastern Idaho, north from where we start here in Pocatello, to an area 100 miles north, around Ashton, where the farmland meets the forest near the headwaters of the North Fork of the Snake River. There's some wonderful country we'll see along the way up here. I do this with a fisheye lens so we get a wide look at the countryside, but it kind of makes things look like we're in a swale. But not always, only on close-ups. So here we go. We're going to make a right turn here. This is Ashton, the town where I went all through school, first grade through senior high. I didn't graduate from this high school, but I went to college anyway at Idaho State University. But that's a story for a different time. We'll make a right turn here on Highway 20 and head toward Yellowstone from here. We won't go all the way to Yellowstone today. There are some other places that most people miss on their way to the park that we will have a look at on the path least traveled. They don't know what they are missing, but you won't miss it today. I'll see to that. We're passing by Rigby, Idaho here. Rigby, Idaho was the home of Philo Farnsworth, the Mormon inventor of television video in 1927. My dad, who was in grade school near Idaho Falls in 1929, said that Philo made a demonstration of television images at his school. He said the lipstick was purple on the lady in the first television image, who was probably Philo's wife on the first television video ever produced. Eastern Idaho is famous for potato production. Ashton is famous for producing seed potatoes because of its short growing season, its black volcanic soil, and its mile-high elevation. A grower in Egan, east of Rexburg, once told me that the potato crops in Ashton were planted a month later, and by July they were caught up to the crops in his area. He might have exaggerated that story a little bit, but not much from what I've seen over the years. We'll see a lot of campers on this road. They're on their way to Yellowstone or perhaps to a favorite camping spot in Island Park. There's some beautiful country up this road with camping spots in many places by the mountains, rivers, lakes, and streams. A good place to relax and let the rest of the world go by. Here you see a railroad bridge on the right side of the video. We're just crossing the South Fork of the Snake River between Rigby and Rexburg, as you can see on the map, that location. At the age of 16, I was stopped in my car one evening by a Rexburg policeman who took away my cigarettes. I just went out and bought some more. It wasn't about the cigarettes. It was about my freedom to choose for myself. I had smoked with my dad and the sawmill crew that I grew up with for more than a year by then. I didn't start out my life with clean living. When I wised up in my 30s, I quit smoking to clear my lungs and my head. It made more sense by then. I hope we can all get a little smarter as we move through the treacherous shoals of life. This is a section of the old Highway 20, route to Yellowstone before 1956, when the new highway was built over the Ashton Hill, replacing this one. This road bypasses the original route that passed through the main streets of every town along the way from Ashton to Salt Lake City before about 1959. When I was 16 years old, I was hauling lumber from my dad's sawmill at Warm River through the main streets of every one of these towns on my way to as far away as Hill Air Force Base near Ogden, Utah. On one trip, I stopped at a music store in Rexburg and bought a trumpet. I was playing the St. Louis Blues in stormy weather while driving the loaded truck. Things were different in those days. We seldom drove a truck over 60 miles an hour. This is a section of the old Highway 20, route to Yellowstone before 1956, when the new highway was built over the Ashton Hill, replacing this one. We're passing St. Anthony here, 14 miles to go to Ashton, where the forest begins. Ashton, Idaho is the last little town in the Snake River Valley before the forest edge, west of the Tetons and Jackson Hole along the old Highway 20 route to the west gate of Yellowstone Park. There was a rodeo arena here, probably still is, where I rode bulls and bareback horses on festive occasions in the 1960s. We are going to cross the Fall River here, my favorite fly fishing stream. I used to match the hatch on this river and tie my own duplicate flies to use on the river. With the right pattern and at the right time of a hatch, I could catch 20 or 30 fish in an hour. I threw them all back, of course, except for a few that I saved for supper. This road bypasses the original route that passed through the main streets of every town along the way from Ashton to Salt Lake City before about 1959. We're going to make a right turn here. This is Ashton, the town where I went all through school, first grade through senior high. I didn't graduate from this high school, but I went to college anyway at Idaho State University. But that's a story for a different time. Ashton gets lots of snow in the winter, and it's famous for sled dog races called the American Dog Derby that began in the 1920s and continues to this day every February. Okay, let's follow this road for about 7 miles to a place called Warm River, where I grew up in a sawmill, where Henry's Fork is joined by the Warm River. We're going to leave the farmland pretty quick and enter the mountains and the forest. This is where it gets interesting. This is where the farmland ends and the mountains begin. We're dropping down into the Warm River area here. Farms are okay, but the forest is better. This is where I grew up in the 1950s. I guess I'm a little partial to the scenery here. The square mountain that you see is still called by the locals Isaacs Mountain. We're coming up to a bridge that replaced the old wooden bridge that went to the sawmill on the other side of the river. Warm River water is not warm. In fact, it's really colder than the other rivers around here. The reason it was named Warm River is because it never freezes over. The river is really a spring that belches out of a mountain about 17 miles upstream from here. It travels such a short distance and so fast that it doesn't have time to freeze before it joins the North Fork of the Snake right here. It sure was good fishing when I was a kid growing up here. Here's what the place looked like when I was a young man. This is a photo taken of the Warm River Lumber Company in the 50s. The sawmill, the planer, the office, and the house that I grew up in. That's probably me on the forklift in the picture. I was pretty good at that. Few kids nowadays get that kind of training and have that much fun. The car in the picture is a 1956 Plymouth. I was run off the highway at 70 miles an hour one night in that car on the way here from Ashton. It was a hot July night in 1957. The car rolled a couple of times and I escaped with a badly broken leg. There were no seat belts in those days. I may have walked away if I'd had one. This is a popular boat launch for a gentle ride from here to the old Wendell Bridge north of Ashton. This road follows an old rail bed where the steam engines would pull freight from Ashton to West Yellowstone. They tore the rails out more than half a century ago. I think they made a mistake because it would be a very popular scenic trip for tourists today. But I guess they got tired of maintaining the track, particularly in the wintertime when they had to move 12 feet of snow in March with a rotary on the front of the engine. The road would take us up the old original road to Yellowstone. There are some nice views of Upper and Lower Mesa Falls and other sites up there, but in the interest of time, I'll save that for another video. I promise we'll come back here soon, and I will share the video with you along with some pretty good adventure stories to go with it. Now let's make a right turn across the Warm River and go up a couple of miles to a place called Shadow Ridge. My brother Bruce moved here about 5 years ago and built a new house in this gated community. When he was planning to move back to this home country, I said to him, "You'll get snowed in." He said, "That's part of the reason why I want to do it." Even I have fond memories of being snowed in at Warm River on several occasions. I don't need it anymore, though, like he does. Here we are at Shadow Ridge Estates. This was the Stevens Ranch before it was sold to the developer. Nellie Stevens came down by the sawmill often in the 50s to pick up Indian arrowheads. She had quite a collection. I found a lot of them too, but I didn't keep them like she did. Where the rivers come together was a campsite for Indians some years before the mill was built in 1895. I'm Garry Isaacs. I hope you enjoyed the ride. When you get back home, open my website, myintegritypath.com, and get my books, Standing Up to the Coup and Searching for Bitcoin. In the meantime, keep in mind who you are and why you are here, and sleep peacefully at night knowing that your integrity is your own responsibility and your Bitcoin is in your own custody.